Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Tequila Midnight by Kathryn Dodson, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Jessica crept down a dirt road blackened by a starless night. 30 miles south of the Texas border, houses made of plywood and corrugated metal lay strewn about the desert like tumbleweeds, and she wandered the tire-rutted path between them. The crack of gunshot blasted through the night. She leapt from the road and slid against the nearest house for cover. Doors and windows closed with a thud or a creak. Lights winked out in the nearby homes, then silence surrounded her. Residual heat from the day's sun still warmed the wall she pressed into, hoping to become invisible. The night had grown cool, and she wished she could stay in the relative comfort of its heat and protection. But she'd come here to make a delivery for an important client, which might mean figuring out the origin of the gunshot and where the bullet had gone. Hopefully, the shots came from some idiot celebrating his kid's birthday or his own manhood. Worst case, one end of the gun belonged to someone in the drug trade, a fairly common occupation on the U.S.-Mexico border. A hit of danger washed through her, clenching her gut with dread, but prickling the skin on her arms with excitement. She shouldn't be here, needed to figure out how her job had gone from fancy industrial real estate deals in executive offices to dropping off paperwork after hours in a part of town so isolated GPS didn't know it existed. She glanced at the manila envelope clenched in her hand. What kind of crap job had Tomas gotten her into? The envelope must have crumpled when she heard the gunshot. She smoothed it against her thigh as best she could. She had a job to do. In her line of work, not delivering killed careers. She stepped back into the street. Light shone through a window a couple of blocks away. That had to be her destination. Tomas's guys wouldn't have been frightened by the gunshot. Hell, it had probably been their guns. She crept forward, taking her time and aiming for quiet. She reached the edge of the property and tucked herself behind the corner of the house to listen, scraping against the rough stucco. It was a solid house for this neighborhood. Voices drifted toward her, and she froze. She'll be here. Jessica recognized Tomas sounding lazy in the amped-up night. Earlier in the day, he'd told her he wouldn't be at the drop site. Clearly, he'd lied. She fingered the packet again. She'd watched him sign the piece of paper and slip it into this very envelope before sealing it and handing it to her. Nothing but paper and ink. She'd never transport drugs or anything else that would get her in real trouble, so why was he here? Creo que no. Low and raspy, Jessica didn't recognize the second man's voice, but he'd probably spent a lifetime sucking on Marlboros. Whoever he was, he didn't believe she'd show up. He clearly didn't know her. She always finished her jobs. It was the only way to get the next one. She stepped away from the house, ready to approach the door. After a single step, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor floated through the open window. She paused, breathless, willing herself not to make a sound. She'll be here, and I can trust her not to open the envelope, unlike you guys. Text me when it's over. Quick footsteps, then a door opened and shut. There must be a back entrance. She heard the roar of an engine, then tires crunching on the gravel. Probably Tomas's enormous black Escalade. What kind of trap had Tomas set for her, and why? She had carefully developed her reputation as a cross-border real estate broker and jack of all trades. She had earned the trust of people in high places on both sides of the border. When they needed a document delivered or money, she preferred not to know as long as it wasn't drugs. Jessica got the call. It could be a real ego stroke, and it could land you in a Mexican shantytown in the middle of the night. She straightened her shoulders and breathed deeply, if quietly, before stepping forward. She paused just before the window and glanced inside. A man stared back at her. The surprise shocked her to her core, but she slipped on her poker face as quickly as possible, squinting her eyes to look tough and hoping he hadn't noticed her moment of fear. Hola? Jessica nodded at him. The man didn't say anything but turned and opened the door. A shaft of light spilled through and illuminated the dusty street. Entree, smoky voice commanded. Jessica passed through the door and into a brightly lit room filled with 5 men, the one at the door and 3 seated in metal folding chairs under bad paintings of Jesus and Mary. The 5th man reclined in a bulky wooden club chair with dirty orange and green cushions straight out of 1975. He was probably the ugliest man she'd ever seen. Dark, mottled skin, a nose that had been punched time too many, thinning hair draped across his dome in strips. Even uglier was the gun resting near his crotch. She almost laughed when she imagined him accidentally shooting himself there. The image kept any fear at bay. Their scare tactics wouldn't work with her. She'd been on her own a long time and had built an impenetrable wall of bravery brick by brick. This was the last guy who'd get past it. I have a package for you, Jessica tried for a bored tone. No habla español? The ugly man's eyes peered up at her. Poquito, just a little, her standard response. She spoke Spanish like a native, but rarely let anyone know, especially on midnight deals that smelled like danger. More than once, those around her had been stupid enough to assume she told them the truth and had casually started spilling secrets, thinking their use of Spanish would protect them. Give it to me. He held his hand out. She paused before handing him the envelope. Usually she consummated deals in a boardroom or at a country club table. She greased the wheels, made things easier. Bringing one sheet of paper to an unsavory character far on the edge of town frustrated her. She didn't want to build this type of business. Tomas had crossed the line and he'd hear about it. She handed the man the envelope without saying anything. I will have one of my men escort you to your car. The words came out in a snarl, although the man's face didn't change. No, thank you. She turned to leave, the sooner the better. I insist. She turned back to him, stressing each word. I said no, thank you. Paco. He nodded at one of the men along the wall. Paco will accompany you, Miss Watts. This neighborhood can be very dangerous. Yeah, thanks to you, but she didn't say anything. She knew who had the gun. As she exited the building, Paco walked beside and slightly behind her. He didn't say a word in the 5 minutes it took to get back to her truck. She got in and started the vehicle while he stood just outside the door, staring at her with crossed arms. His position pulled his shirt up enough so she could see the pistol tucked into his waistband. She didn't flinch. Paco could show off, but he was way too far down the org chart to decide who got shot. She drove away, relieved to be done with assholes with guns for the night. Her fingers turned the stereo up to 11 because blasting AC/DC made her feel like a badass. It made fear impossible. She was going to kill Tomas. Well, not literally kill. There was enough competition for that on the streets of the Mexican drug war. A typical next-generation son of a wealthy Mexican businessman, Tomas wouldn't have sent her into a situation that would lead to bad press, especially since he planned on expanding Daddy's empire to both sides of the border. She'd helped him obtain real estate for his nightclubs and mobile communications company in El Paso and Juarez. On her recommendation, he joined the El Paso Chamber of Commerce, and Jessica had even set up a few meetings with city officials for him. She'd proven herself useful. He wouldn't want her killed. By the time she pulled up to the Bridge of the Americas, one of 3 border crossings between Juarez, Mexico, and El Paso, Texas, her breathing had slowed and her anger had returned to a medium simmer. She'd leave Tomas for another day, but she still needed to work off the rage. She told her phone app to call Angus. What's up? He asked, answering on the 3rd ring. Are you smoking? Do you have someone over? She didn't mean for the questions to come out sharp, not when she needed a favor, but she knew Angus. He'd been her best friend since elementary school and remained trapped in some kind of post-high school nirvana of shaggy hair, rock and roll, and weed. Although tonight, she needed him to be the responsible one. You're a little keyed up. I'm alone and watching a movie. Want to come over? He asked. Nah, I've got to head out tonight. Can you take care of Tila? Yeah, he breathed the word in a sigh of heavy disappointment. Anything else? Thanks, I owe you. She always owed him. She should have gotten a cat instead of a dog when she couldn't have one of those multi-day feeders and wouldn't have to rely on anyone. She'd prefer that to begging favors. You know there's a way you can pay me back. The innuendo sounded sexual, but experience said she'd receive a lecture on good behavior if she bid. Gotta go. I'm at the border station. Thanks for your help. She ended the call before he could guilt her into going home instead of out. She needed loud music and strong drinks tonight. Vices without bullets. Jessica opened the door to the bar, and the stench of beer, sweat, and Mexican food beckoned and repulsed her. The sound of pool cues hitting balls and David Bowie's Major Tom assaulted her ears. She smiled. A dive bar on a Thursday night could soothe the soul like nothing else. She took her place on the round vinyl and chrome stool, but kept her elbows off the sticky bar. The rectangular bar top filled the center of the room, and two bartenders in the middle served stale beer and whatever else customers wanted. She waved two fingers at Scott, her favorite barkeep. "What'll it be?" he asked. "A shot of Patron and a double IPA. "You're here late." He poured the shot and placed it on the bar in front of her. She slugged it down, enjoying the burn in her throat. "Yeah, I've got some catching up to do. Can I have another, Scotty?" "Let me get your beer first." She watched him walk to the other end of the bar. His Wranglers fit perfectly. Of course, she already knew that. She'd taken them off him once. She surveyed the room. Dudes with long hair played pool. A couple of suits she recognized sat on bar stools. A few couples whispered across square tables. Who brought a date to a place like this? She noticed a big guy leaning over the jukebox. Levi's, and they fit better than Scott's Wranglers. "Here you go," Scott said, setting a frosty pint of amber liquid in front of her. "You still want that second shot?" "Damn straight, when have you known me to stop at one?" "Never." Smile lines crinkled toward his shaved head, but his blue eyes held something sad. "You know I love you, Scotty." "Honey, you love everyone." "Every chance I get," Jessica said, downing the second shot. She felt better already. She finished half her beer when the big guy returned from the jukebox. He took a seat directly opposite her across the bar. He was gorgeous. She took a long sip from the beer to give her mouth something to do besides gape. He had to be 6'5", with messy platinum blonde hair and eyes that you could drown in. His arms and shoulders were just this side of bodybuilder. A girl could bury herself in that body. Warmed by the alcohol, she took off her leather jacket, staring at the guy the whole time. Scott stepped into her field of vision. "It looks like your blue eyes are wandering. Can I get you anything?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. He knew her game. "Yeah, another shot, and send one to him." She nodded across the bar. Scott gave her a hard look, but one side of his mouth tweaked up in a grin. "Should I warn him about you?" "He looks like he can handle himself." As soon as Scott had served the guy, she lifted her shot glass to him. He had the look of a confused puppy, but a guy that hot would have garnered plenty of free drinks. She watched him smell the tequila, never a good idea. She held her glass aloft, waiting for him to down the shot, but he got off the bar stool instead and circled his way to her. "Scotty, I need some limes." This guy was an amateur. Scott set down limes in a salt shaker just as the guy arrived. His broad shoulders practically blocked out the sun, or at least the bar light over the pool table, which wavered nicely in her more liquid world. She loved this moment when all the edges softened. Thank God for tequila. "Hi," the guy said. "I'm Jessica." She waved her glass in front of him. "Don't tell me you're not a tequila fan." "I thought I'd come enjoy it with you. You've got limes." He visibly brightened. "Yeah, we can do this the old-fashioned way." She licked the inside of her forearm and sprinkled salt on the wet patch. Jessica locked eyes with him as she slowly licked the salt from her arm. She had to turn away to find her glass on the bar, and when she turned back, he felt closer. At 5'10", she rarely felt small, but he loomed over her in the sexiest way possible. This kind of danger she could handle. She brought the shot glass to her lips and let the liquid slide down her throat, slow and languorous. She swam in his pool blue eyes, savoring the last drop of tequila. Trading the glass for fruit, she brought a lime to her lips. She ran her tongue over it, but didn't bite. "Now it's your turn," she said. He nodded, not saying anything. She released his eyes and let her own travel down the length of him. His thin T-shirt hinted at hard muscles. Her hands wanted to touch him. Hell, she wanted to press her whole body against his. She let her eyes fall to faded denim. Apparently, he wanted the same. The tequila radiated through her, filling the world with possibility. She looked back into his eyes. "Ready?" He nodded again. Not a lot of words with this one. She reached for his forearm with both hands, turning its pale inside toward her. "May I?" she asked. She understood the importance of consent. "Please," his voice cracked. The skin warmed her cold fingers, and she dropped her head, her dark hair falling next to his tan forearm. She reached for it with her tongue, running it along the soft, hot skin. She kissed his arm before lifting her head. "Salt," she whispered, tasting it on her tongue. She found the salt shaker with one hand and poured a fine layer onto the wet spot she'd left. She released him and handed him his glass. His cheeks had gone bright red. He lifted his arm and sucked the salt from it as if stealing the remnant of her kiss. Briefly, his hand wrapped around hers, then he took the glass from her. He threw the shot back in a gulp, then reached past her for a lime, wincing as he bit into it. Man, I hate that stuff. He ran the back of his hand under his watering eyes. Sorry, you should have told me. No way. I wouldn't have missed that for the world. Her smile reached down to her toes. This was going to be everything. Gorgeous guy up for a little fun, and he wanted her. He made the unpleasantness of her earlier job fade away. They spoke words she couldn't remember seconds after they hit the air. Her arm drifted to his. He sat on the stool beside hers, facing her so their knees interlocked, long legs touching. She learned he'd arrived in town a few weeks ago. Maybe he was from Idaho or someplace like that. He came here to work for a cousin's shipping company. It sounded boring. His body spoke louder, warm and close and bulging in all the right places. He wouldn't solve all her problems, but he definitely solved the ones she had tonight. By the time she settled the bill with Scott, the guy had his hands at her waist. The minute they were out the door, he pulled her to him and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and didn't meet any of her needs. She locked her arms around his neck and practically crawled up him, pulling his bottom lip into her mouth, forcing him to acknowledge her desire. He lifted her and she wrapped her legs around him. She'd never been with someone so strong he carried her like she was nothing. Soon her back pressed against the behold metal of a truck, hopefully his. She wanted him, all of him, as soon as possible. In the cool tequila night, he could fill every need she had. Is there someplace we can go? She asked. Yes, the word came out in a breathless growl. She heard the truck unlock and he slid her down his body until her feet touched pavement. She crawled into the cab and slid into the passenger seat. A pang of regret slipped through her as they passed her truck, but she shouldn't drive. The awkward silent drive only lasted 5 minutes on empty streets. He pulled into a driveway in front of a squat brick house in a 1950s development full of almost identical homes. Beyond lawn maintenance and the color of the bricks, she couldn't have told them apart. She brought her focus back to the guy. She couldn't remember his name. It didn't matter as much as his body. Is this okay? He asked, his pool blue eyes gone dark in the night. Jessica placed her hands on either side of the strong jaw and pulled him toward her. Her lips brushed his gently once, then again. The passion raged back, and they made out like teenagers with 5 minutes left until curfew. Come on, he said, pulling her out of the truck. We have to be quiet when we go in the house. Giggling, they tiptoed through the entryway and down a hall until he pulled her into a large room set up like a studio apartment. He'd made his bed. Jessica never made her bed. The door closed, the lock clicking into place. Then he came up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to pull her close. His other hand lifted the hair from her neck. He kissed her below her ear, on her collarbone, next to her bra strap. She leaned into him, knowing he would fill every empty spot inside her. Jessica woke to a headache that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. Her eyes itched, and she would have killed someone for a glass of water. The gentle snoring beside her also seemed timed to her pulsing head. She got out of bed and made her way to the kitchenette along one side of the room, fumbled for the faucet, and once she heard water, stuck her head under and drank. She'd seen cats do it better on YouTube. She found her pants and with them her phone. It wasn't quite 6 o'clock. She had to leave, but of course her truck was miles away. She went and sat on the bed beside the beautiful man, wishing she could remember his name. Hey, wake up. Good morning. He grunted, but didn't wake. She rubbed her hand along his torso, a heady combination of soft skin and hard muscle. Hey, wake up. He rolled onto his back, releasing a wave of inviting heat. Come back to bed. I can't. I've got to go work. Can you drive me to my truck? Sure, just a minute. He groaned again and sat up, giving her a lopsided grin before stretching and exposing every perfect muscle on his chest. Memories of hands and mouths and teeth on skin reeled through her brain. She fought them off. Her body betrayed her as a shot of electricity ran from swollen lips to breasts and lower. She wanted to climb back on top of him almost as much as she wanted to leave. She jumped up from the bed and looked for the rest of her clothes. The minute he was dressed, she left the bedroom and headed for the front door. She heard voices in another part of the house and prayed she wouldn't run into anyone. Hey, Brett, is that you? Jessica had already opened the door and hurried out. Brett, she assumed, slipped out behind her. Sorry, that was my cousin's wife. It's probably best that she doesn't see us leaving. Works for me, Jessica said. She climbed into his truck and noticed the garage and Brett's bedroom shared the same location. Great. They drove through a gray light, special to mornings on the west side of El Paso. A stark desert mountain range bisected the city, and while the dawn seared the eastern side of the mountains, the west side remained shaded from the early morning light. On a normal day, Jessica would have enjoyed the cool desert air and black mountains outlined in the bright of the rising sun. Today was not normal. Of course, it wasn't abnormal either. Sometimes she needed a warm body and the hunger of another person that matched her own. This guy was better than most. He'd fed that hunger again and again until they fell asleep, slick and exhausted in each other's arms. Unfortunately, now he verged on ruining a good thing by talking. Honestly, did he just thank her for coming over? She sure wasn't going to thank him for filling her up 8 ways to Sunday, even though she was damn grateful. Can I take you to dinner tonight? He asked. I'm sorry, I've got a standing date with my neighbors on Friday. He gave her a quizzical glance, but she didn't explain. She didn't want him to fish for a reason to invite himself over. She lived by one and done, or tried to. How about this weekend? I've got plenty of time off and you can show me some of your favorite places in town. I'm sorry, I can't. He actually looked sad. Most guys acted like she'd given them a Christmas present when she didn't want to stick around. I've got to go out of town this weekend and see my parents. Now, why the hell had she said that? That's the last thing she'd ever do. I thought you said your parents had died. Shit, she didn't remember telling him that. It's just a figure of speech. Which part? That they died or that you're going to visit them? They left me when I was 16, and I haven't seen them since. So in a way, it's like they died, and I lied about going to see them. I'm sorry. You seem really nice, and I had a fantastic time last night. I mean, really fantastic. She reached over and stroked his denim-covered thigh. Honestly, I just don't want a relationship. He stopped talking after that. She thanked him for the ride when he dropped her off at the parking lot. He screeched away like Richard Petty. She hadn't meant to piss him off. She'd developed phenomenal interpersonal skills as part of her job, skills that helped her talk about money or international relations. But they abandoned her the second she slept with someone. Her lack of tact around personal relationships was just one reason she never dated people she met through work. Instead, she'd perfected her pickup routine. She could count on one hand the number of guys she still talked to that she'd taken to bed. No strings, no regrets, no future. The thought stripped away all the satisfaction from the night before. She could still feel him on her body, but the fullness she'd enjoyed had disappeared, leaving a familiar hollow space. She shook her head as she started the truck. Maybe she was just hungry. She stopped by the Whataburger drive-thru for 2 breakfast taquitos, then drove the 15 miles home to the horse farm on the outskirts of town, her getaway where she could leave the city behind. She loved El Paso, but it housed a lot of bad memories. Each mile she drove ratcheted down the tension of lousy parents, a questionable job, and her own dubious decisions. The last quarter of a mile, the road turned to washerboard dirt, then she entered 64 acres of paradise. Railroad tie fencing outlined rows of dark green alfalfa. The road continued toward a terracotta-colored home and barn with bright white fencing lining the pens and arena. Jessica didn't follow the road, but turned off onto a short drive that ended at a small rectangular adobe building. Home. And despite what she told Brett, she did not need to work today. She couldn't wait to crawl into her unmade bed and fade into nothingness. She expected to hear Tila at the door, scratching and whining. The Catahoula leopard dog hadn't had a waking moment of stillness since Jessica brought her home 4 years ago. She swung the door open to find Angus asleep on the couch and Tila staring at her from where she snuggled in the crook of his knees. Hey, girl. Jessica rubbed the dog's head and silky ears, one blue eye and one green eye, looking into her own with nothing but love shining back. She kissed the dog's forehead, then went to find aspirin and water. Fortunately, she only had to take 3 steps to the right to enter the kitchen. A large bottle of Tylenol waited for her on the counter where she'd left it after the last bender. She stuck a glass under the tap and filled it to the top before downing 2 pills. Angus stirred. You're back. Yep. Thanks for taking care of Tila. I didn't see your car outside. Angus rolled over, dislodging the dog. His dark hair splayed in every direction, permanently in need of a haircut. His half-closed, sleepy eyes tried to focus on her as he spoke. Parked up at the main house. I had to talk to Luz and Sarah about something. Hopefully not about me. She tried staring him down, but he didn't seem to notice. Jessica had become adept at avoiding lectures from friends, but she hoped Angus had covered for her. Nope, I'm thinking about helping Sarah with that kids' therapy program she wants to start with the horses. Tila scratched at the bottom of the door and whined. A ball of energy, that dog had 2 settings, asleep or on the move. The sleep setting had clearly switched off. I'll take you for a run in just a minute. Let me shower first, Jessica said to the dog. I'll take her, Angus said. I can let her run up to the big house and get in the car. I'll drop her off when I leave. Every muscle relaxed. Jessica could shower, crawl into bed, and not worry about anything. Thanks. I owe you big time again. Don't worry. I'm keeping track. You'll pay me back someday. Are you going to be up at the house for happy hour? I wouldn't miss it. She walked over and planted a kiss on his forehead. Thanks. You saved me. Then she headed to the tiny bathroom to wash away the fear and grime and sex that had collected in her pores. I'm trying to, he said. Jessica closed the door on his words. She refused to add guilt to the mix.